Museum Services Assistant at the Meaford Museum.
And I'm Morgan Woodhouse. I'm the curator at the Bishop Museum.
And we have Matt Johnson, who's from Marathon of History, and he's going to be introducing our speaker today. But we just wanted to thank all of you from both of our museums for coming today. We're so excited that you're here, and we're so excited that Mark has made a stop in Meaford for us to talk tonight. So we're just going to let him talk. So we're going to get off stuff now. All about him.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. This is much appreciated. This is a fantastic venue. And thank you to the Meaford Museum and Billy Bishop Museum for putting all of this together. And thank you, Mark, for traveling about 16,000 kilometers to... for those of you who know, Mark's from Victoria, so he's been in Italy and North Europe for the last month, and then came back here on Tuesday. So he's got a few miles on. So thank you for coming, Mark. I just want to point out a couple other people. We have John Cannon in the back there. He's from Liberation Tours. Mark works with John doing battlefield tours throughout Europe. So if you have any questions after about a battlefield tour, John is the man to see. And we also have Frances here, Mark's partner, who's also a very accomplished author. And I kind of feel we should also bring her in and ask her some questions about her work. So, but no, as I say, I really appreciate everybody coming. Thank you. And Mark Zuehlke. It doesn't need a lot of introduction. 14 books in the Canadian Battle Series. How many other books, Mark? You have
29.
29. So 29 books. He knows his stuff. So, and tonight we're going to just do a little bit of a conversation. I have some questions, but if anybody has a question, if something pops to mind, just put your hand up, and we can just answer it right there, so you don't forget. Unless we really get down a rabbit hole, in which case I might just swing back the agenda. But if you want to ask a question, just stand up or put your hand up and stand up. If you need the microphone, just ask me and I'll run the microphone over to you. That's no problem. Mark's here to answer all your questions. So without further talking by me, we're gonna talk to Mark. The mics are on, and the mics are on. Okay. I kind of like this setup. I feel like I should have a roaring fireplace in behind it. Mark and I should have pipes and sitting there. yeah. So the first question, I'm sure on a lot of people's mind, Mark, you have a background in journalism. How did you transition, or what happened to go from journalism to writing 29 books about Canadian military history?
I got into it. I'd done some research and thinking, and I was always interested in history and military history in particular. But as Matt said, my training was in journalism. I was working in journalism in Kelowna, in the Okanagan Valley. And Remembrance Day came around, and Remembrance Day I would go to the 7th half locally in Kelowna. And in those days, there were lots of veterans still around. This is early 1990s. And so I went to, you'd always after the Remembrance Day ceremonies, you'd go to the Legion, and the veterans would be there, and the Legion would serve that stew, and you'd talk to the veterans. And so I was talking with some veterans at a table, and they were all from Edmonton. They'd all retired. Everybody in Alberta retires to the Okanagan, and so they had retired to Kelowna, and they were all had served in the Blood Edmonton Regiment, and they were talking about this battle called Ortona, and about how awful the fighting over a 6-day period was in December 1943 in this little Italian town. And I realized I'd never even heard of Ortona, didn't know anything about it. So I went out to get a book on it, and there wasn't one. And there was really nothing about Ortona at all in the Canadian military history, except in the official history of the Canadians in the Italian campaign. There were a few chapters about it, but it was very general. And I just put that up against what these guys had been telling me, and I thought, there really needs to be a book about this. And then it was like, well, who writes the book? Well, it's one of those the buck stops here kind of things. And so that's really what started it, was that interest generated by meeting those veterans.
So Mark, Did you have an interest in military history before that, or just kind of a passing interest? In general?
I had an interest in it, but there was a time when the possibility of actually publishing military history was very remote. Canadian publishers weren't publishing military history, particularly World War II military history, much at all. And in fact, so it was an interest, but I couldn't see how would you do this? And so that actually became an issue with the Ortona book, because I put together a book proposal like you do, and I had an agent, and she was marketing it around Canada to all the publishers. And we were getting a response back all the time of, World War II was a long time ago. We really cared, was really the attitude. And so the book wasn't going anywhere. And then 1997, I think, comes around, and Saving Private Ryan comes out. And within 3 days of the film being auditioned or premiering in Toronto, the editor who had said, nobody really cares anymore, contacted my agent, said, that book on Ortona, is it still out there? And there was a sea change that happened, because in Victoria we have our Remembrance Day ceremonies there. The main one is at a cenotaph that's out in front of the Victoria Legislature. And traditionally, you would go down there and there would be the military and the police and the firefighters and veterans, and then about 500 people from the general public attending. The year that Saving Private Ryan came out, I went down to the Remembrance Day ceremony, and there were 3,000 people there. And they brought their kids. There were a lot of young families. So I like to say that Steven Spielberg put my career on its path to where it is today. And that statistic of the 3,000 that came to the Remembrance Day ceremony in Victoria is interesting, because it has sustained itself ever since. So we're now, 28 years or whatever from that, and there's still 2,500 to 3,000 people kind of regularly attend the ceremonies, and they're still bringing their children and their grandchildren and that to the ceremonies. So I do think the whole culture of remembrance is continuing in a way that it wasn't in the 1990s. It was really sort of starting to look like it was going to fade away. But as people are, once people go down the path of actually experiencing remembrance activities, I think it grows, and they then want to pass that on to their children and their grandchildren, and so I'm very optimistic that Canada will continue to have a strong remembrance culture as we go forward.
Well, even just having this many people here tonight, that's an example of that. And it's interesting how Hollywood cinema really sort of spanned the generations with Saving Private Ryan to bring that awareness back. There was, like you said, people bringing their kids, older people, veterans. It's really quite something. So we don't want to talk about you anymore, Mark. We want to talk about, of course, Francis is a very accomplished writer as well. Now, I kind of wonder, two professional writers in the same household, you guys must have some really interesting conversations. And do you guys bounce ideas off each other? How does that dynamic work?
Yes, we do. And Francis always grab the microphone and she wrestle it away and say, no, it's not like that. I think we tend to always play the ideas back and forth with each other. We don't interfere much in each other's writing. We would never co-author a book. That might just jeopardize the whole relationship. But we work together really well, and we're both very comfortable working from home, and so that makes life easy. And it is one nice part of being writers is that you can work from home, and it's not like you can say, well, we're going to go off. We can go off anytime we want and do anything we want, because there's always deadlines. exercise out of work, and one or the other of us will have a deadline. But yeah, so it works out fine.
I can imagine you have some interesting conversations anyways, with both of your topics. So tell us a bit about becoming a battlefield guide, Mark. That's a totally different kind of history from writing to actually being there and taking people through. What's that experience like?
It's really good. I had worked with a couple other battlefield companies before I got involved with Liberation Tours, and actually when John and Phil Craig, who's the other co-owner of Liberation Tours, approached me about coming on and doing tours with them, I was very, probably not, that I probably wouldn't do it, because the experiences I'd had with the other companies were, you were kind of just window dressing as a historian along with it. It was sort of like, they'd sort of say, well, maybe here you could say a few things, and it was like, there wasn't any kind of, real expectation of what you would do, and I always just felt that they were kind of disorganized, and decided I didn't really want to be involved. And then John and Phil approached me and they said, well, we have a different approach. And I looked at what they do and I liked it, and we've been working together ever since. And the difference, I think, is it's kind of like what we are doing is kind of like an Italian campaign 101 history college level kind of thing. So we immerse the people into the experience of the battle. We have a lot of stories that we bring from the side of veterans. We personalize it a lot so that people understand what it was like to be, a young 21-year-old soldier coming ashore in Sicily and going into battle for the first time. What does that actually mean, at that time? And look at that. And so we give the campaign details, and at the same time we don't get bogged down in so much detail that it becomes, for people who are just trying to understand the battlescape, the landscape and the battlefield, that they're not getting bogged down into, a third division went forward, refusing its left and all that sort of military talk. Most people wouldn't even begin to know what any of them were talking about. So we make it more understandable by taking people onto the battlefield. Once people get to a battlefield and actually understand how it worked, what the landscape, how the geography influences the development of the battle, it really changes how people perceive things. They understand it more clearly. And then you get to the cemeteries and you see the cost of it all. And that, in our experience, that's, it's a real game changer for people when they come and they've seen a couple battlefields. We've talked about what was the experience of combat, and then you come and you see, well, this is the consequences of combat, and still emotionally, that's when even people who are along because their partner wanted to come along. They generally at that point, they're now part of the remembrance culture that, they always will be. So I think, and for me, as a historian who usually sits in my office, clacking away on a keyboard and staring at documents, being able to see that kind of transformation in people's hearts is really, it's a whole different way of coming at things. It's very sobering, and you feel very kind of humbled to that, you can have that kind of impact on people, or the experience can have that impact. It's not that I'm having that impact on them.
Yeah, well, it's certainly one thing I noticed about any battlefields I've been to. It's like even just the smell of the place. It just gives you an idea of what it was like to be there. You just can't get it through a book, or a documentary. And I see the sun's coming out.
Yes.
So I guess we're in the clear for tornadoes for now. Mark, I find battlefields to be both beautiful and haunting. I'm sure anybody here who's been to a battlefield would feel the same. One place that sticks out in my mind that I've been to is the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, American Civil War. And I've always felt walking around that place, even if I didn't know that was a battlefield, I knew something bad happen here. There's an energy. Where on your tours and where that you've gone, where stands out in your mind as just a place that's like such hallowed ground?
One of the ones that for me is particularly poignant is a beach in Dieppe called Puys. It's where the Royal Regiment landed on the August 9th, 1942. It's when you see that beach and see how it's very narrow. You come in, there's cliffs here, cliffs facing, and a cliff over here. And it's a very narrow beach. It's about, really, probably only about 3 times the size of the length of this room. And you imagine, 800 Canadians in landing craft landing on that beach and on the shale, a cobble, with the Germans all around with their machine guns. And you see the absolute hopelessness of the situation. Like, they didn't have a chance. And you stand on that beach, and it's so poignant to realize that regiment, they were slaughtered in minutes, and they never even had a chance. And then you look at the people, you get mad because you start thinking, who in God's name planned this thing? And so that's one of the beaches one of the battlefields that I find very poignant and tragic, really. And you can feel it. There's a funny aura around standing on that beach. It's almost like the ghosts are still there.
It's almost heartbreaking, like you say, to see that they had no chance. Like it's. Does anybody have any questions yet for Mark? Norm?
Who planned that? It's a really good starting point for my question. I've read several of your books, most of them at this point, and a lot of them that's audiobooks, doing other things. But so often when I'm listening, I will say, I will get angry at Canada's high command, the ones that came out, the permanent force guys who came out of RMC, supposedly knowing what they were doing, and they were absolutely bloody useless. When I think of Young, I've just been listening to Breakout from Juno, and Hugh, Brigadier Young. Like, he had no business being in that kind of position of power. So, why was our permanent force that came out of the 1920s and 30s and functioning during the war so bloody awful? But all of the good officers seem to come up from the militia. But they were just awful.
Yeah, so there are a few permanent force ones, but generally I would agree that they were underwhelming. A lot of them were World War I veterans at the higher level, and you see a process where it takes them a long time to stop thinking in World War I terms of how to run it down.
Fighting the last war.
Yeah, and to a degree, that's what Canada does. We go to war prepared for the one we just got out of, and don't necessarily, like we've seen, we come out of Afghanistan, and now we're into a Cold War, a return to the Cold War kind of scenarios. We haven't really, the army was getting, reoriented to being able to fight Afghanistan kind of, irregular forces, that kind of thing. And now it's fighting, now it's the prospect of fighting regular forces. Dieppe, the Canadians came into it kind of late, so they had really no control over that plan. That was a plan that was developed by Combined Operation Headquarters, which was led by Lord Louis Mountbatten. And so they inherited a plan that had been modified again and again and again. And partly the blame also falls to General Bernard Montgomery. because he was the one who was brought in to assess the plan, because once the Canadians were involved, we were under his command in South England. So he came in and he tweaked the plan, and the emphasis had been that the tanks would land over at Pourville, another village on the other side from Puy, and also further north than at Puy. Puy would not have been a beach. But he said, no, we have to land the tanks on the beach in Dieppe. Otherwise, there's no point in doing the raid. You know, you got to take the town. Because that's the only thing of value. And so at that point, they have to shrink the flanks, and they end up with Puy. So it's a disaster of planning. You know, they didn't even know that there was what they were landing on was called chert, this hard rock. You know, they should have known that. You know, the British have been, tourists have been coming over to Dieppe for decades because it was a big resort and casino, the hangout for lower class Brits. So, you know, that's the kind of thing. There's these plans made, and then things go into play, and the consequences that, you know, young people die.
If I could say something, I read somewhere that the Canadians were at Dieppe because they had been in England for 2 years. They hadn't done anything. They were pushing to take part in something, and the Canadian government was pushing. Saying, come on, you got to use our troops for something.
No, and that's true. There was a huge, back in Canada, there was a big backlash happening, both in the House of Commons and in the media, and amongst, you know, retired World War I soldiers, that there was the Canadians who were involved in Bomber Command. There were the Canadians who were involved in the convoys going across the Pacific, so the Navy and the Air Force was completely active. But our military army was sitting in England training. And, you know, when are they going to get into the fight? And so there's all these theories in the 1960s that Canadians were used as cannon fodder by the British and put in Dieppe, but that doesn't hold water, because we, you know, we asked to be there. You know, it was Harry Crerar, the commander of the second Canadian Corps at that time, who brought pressure and was able to influence within the British government to finally get Mackenzie King to agree that we had to send some Canadian troops, had to be involved in that. And so that's how we ended up at Dieppe. It wasn't, you know, it was our choice of sorts.
I think we might have to put a pin in Dieppe, but we could probably talk about that for
yeah, exactly. Dieppe is a rabbit hole.
Mark will be around after for sure. So Mark, you've traveled extensively throughout Europe. It sounds like we're really pushing liberation tours here tonight. How you know, you've been to Belgium, France, all these places. How does their commitment to remembrance compare to Canadians in general?
I would say they're pushing the bar higher. We in Canada, and you know, there's a reason for this. Is the fighting? Their countries were battlefields, and they were fought over, and the cemeteries are there, and so remembrance is very easy. It's not easy to do, but it's a lot easier to do.
Very prevalent.
It's very prevalent. It's part of their culture. It's part of what they lived through. When you go with a tour there, there's always young people who come up and thank you for being a Canadian and coming and liberating you. And you're like, well, I didn't actually play a part in it, but you know, you're welcome. And then you get old elderly people who really come up and you know, we just got back from doing Italy and the Normandy 80th anniversary celebrations, and I was struck, particularly in both countries, similarities with how often we'd be walking down a street and that, and just an elderly person would come up and say, you know, in Italy they call it Canadese, you know, and they're saying, you know, I was 16 years old when you came through our village and you gave us food and clothing and things like that, and you know, you saved our lives. And well, when you have these kind of experiences on a kind of day-to-day basis as you're traveling around, it's pretty profound. And we were having the same experience in Normandy. Just every time we went to a monument in one of the villages where Canadians, there's a monument to Canadians who were killed there, almost inevitably there was this elderly person who would come out of one of the houses next door to it and say, you know, I was here. I was 12 years old, I was 16 years old, and I remember when this happened, and I remember the Canadians, and so, you know, that's a big part of the thing. And what we're finding, we have a lot of relationships that we've built over the years with local groups. In Italy, for example, I'll just use one example, there's a group up by Ravenna called Wartime Friends. And there's a Canadian cemetery there called Villanova Canadian War Cemetery, out by a village called Bagnacavallo. And they take care of that cemetery. And that group is at ages of anything from 70 to in their 20s, who are part of the group. And then they do programs in the local schools where they get kids involved in, you know, what's remembrance, you know, remembering, you know, the Canadians came and they liberated our villages and that sort of thing, and the kids write essays. You know, I was talking with the curator at Billy Bishop today. We went to their museum and they had done this project of remembrance with their school kids in Owen Sound. Who wrote about different individual soldiers, and then they were over for the 80th anniversary. So that's the kind of thing, same kind of thing that they're doing in the Ravenna area with the Wartime Friends. The kids choose a soldier that's headstone is in their cemetery, and then they research that soldier. And they learn everything they can about them, and they write a little essay about them, and then they present at the cemetery on the Italian equivalent of Remembrance Day, which is not November 11th. I can't remember what the date is. So it's a you know, again, they're really keeping the light of remembrance alive in Italy, and then of course you go up to Holland, and it's, you know, the Dutch are completely, you know, they continue. Well, we're going to be doing a tour in April, May next year, because it's the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Holland, and the Dutch are planning a massive celebration, basically, of them being liberated.
I feel like we should have a counter here every time we talk about liberation tours. So Mark, we're gonna flash back in time a little bit here. When I think of Mark Zuehlke, I think of Second World War. You have a War of 1812 book. That seems incredibly not down your usual subjects. How did that come about?
Well, that came about through the publisher themselves, which was Random House. And there was an editor there who isn't there anymore. But he was interested in War of 1812, and he wanted to do a book. And we kicked around, Pierre Burton had done really the definitive book on the actual military side of the War of 1812 and some of the political side. Then there's all the American books about how America won the War of 1812, and we won't go there. And there was all this. So we were kicking around, and I was looking at it, and I was very skeptical of the idea, because, what could we bring new to it? And then I started looking at the actual negotiations that brought the war to an end, which was the Treaty of Ghent. And so these are negotiations that are being done in Belgium, in Ghent, at a huge remove from where the battlefield was taking place. And So there were these Americans who were sent, and there was these Brits who went, and no Canadians were involved. But what I was interested in is, okay, there's decisions that are being made in the negotiations, but it's all based on stuff that's happened months ago, because it's not like you can send a cablegram or pick up a telephone. It's months of waiting for a ship to sail from North America to Kent and tell you, oh, this is what's happening.
Assuming it gets there.
Assuming it even gets there, that's right. Like the storms might sink it, or one of the asides might sink it. So it was really interesting watching how, as I went through the research, these guys were, making these decisions over a battlefield and this whole war that was taking place months removed from what they were talking about. And yet they sort of moved forward and managed to reach a peace agreement. So it was that part fascinated me. So we then just wove the whole entire book around that. And I really like that book because it's got this unique way of coming at the War of 1812. And so the Americans, why do they claim they won the War of 1812? Because of the Battle of New Orleans. But the treaty had actually been signed 2 months before that battle occurred. So, we had made peace, but nobody knows that back in North America. So they're fighting this battle down in New Orleans that didn't need to be fought.
Talk about a useless waste of life to the extreme. They have to do.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, so back to more modern times, say 20th century. What is a battle or a campaign or a military action that you feel was underrepresented, that you were able to bring light to through your work? I mean, I think of the Leary Valley and the Italian campaign and some of those things that weren't quite as heavily covered.
Yeah, I think, the Italian campaign, the entire Italian campaign wasn't very well covered. So all of the books in that series are dealing with stuff that really wasn't, it doesn't get attention. And it didn't, and that's why they were called the D-Day Dodgers as a negative term. But with looking at the Northwest Europe, I wrote a book called Cinderella Campaign, and it's about when the First Canadian Army comes out of Normandy and is advancing up the left flank. So we're on the left flank of the entire Allied army, and we have to take the ports of Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, and move up into, ultimately, to open up Antwerp. And thank you. I was seriously leaving. It's a campaign that got very little attention, even in the official history. It's given about 50 pages, and yet the amount of fighting the Canadians were doing in that time frame is huge. And the reason it's called the Cinderella Campaign is because the First Canadian Army started calling itself the Cinderella Army because they were always they were the last ones to receive supplies, and yet they were always given the hardest fighting in their minds, and in my mind, and they were never invited to the party at the end. So they were like the Cinderella. So for example, like when Antwerp was liberated and the port was opened up, well, it was Canadians who opened up the port of Antwerp. When the first ships come in to deliver supplies into that port, which will now go to the Allies, there wasn't a single Canadian invited to the big ceremony of, we're opening up the port of Antwerp. Not a single Canadian was invited there. The only Canadian presence there was the first ship in was a Canadian freighter. And so there's this thing that, the First Canadian Army was always given really tough jobs to do, but it wasn't even during the war, it wasn't being particularly recognized, the contribution we were making. And after the war, we were just generally not recognized by particularly the British and American historians and history. And as an example of that, in 1990, maybe 1985, I can't remember, there was one of the big D-Day, it was 90 because it was the 45th anniversary of the D-Day thing. There was this big parade in Normandy, and there were hundreds of American veterans, hundreds of British veterans, and there were several hundred Canadian veterans there. And when the parade happened, the Canadians started moving forward, thinking they were in charge of the parade, and the security stopped them from going into the parade. So, what are you doing here? Well, we're Canadians. And I said, well, you have nothing to do with D-Day. And turned them away. And so the moment the security turned their heads, the Canadians tagged onto the back end of the march. Out of that, Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto I think some of their people were present at it. They saw what happened, and they hired a woman called Jean Portugal, who was a journalist. And she went across the country interviewing hundreds of Canadians who were involved in the invasion of D-Day. And they published a 6-volume oral history of it called We Were There. And I just like that point.
It almost reminds me of, when you're talking about Antwerp, it almost reminds me of the Leary Valley and the fighting towards Rome. Canadians, led for that and didn't really get a lot of recognition in the end for what we did.
Actually, we're told to stand down if we entered Rome before the Americans. The General Mark Clark said, "We will fire on you."
There's a chance they might have.
But there were some Canadians who got there before you. There was Bill Wharton and I can't remember the other fellow from the Seaforth Highlanders. They jumped on a motorcycle. They roared into Rome about 12 hours before the Americans arrived. They went and sat in a bar. They drank. They went. There was a clothing store next door, and they went and bought some suits, good Italian suits, and then they drove home again, and nobody was ever the wiser. So Bill Wharton always said, "I liberated Rome."
That's funny. So one thing about Americans is they obviously like to promote their own history. It seems every time an American general had a cup of coffee, they wrote a memoir about it. And I was interviewing actually Tim Cook one time, name dropping, but we were talking about that, how Canadians didn't make as many memoirs, Canadians didn't record those. How did you find that researching your books, and how difficult was that we didn't maybe have as many memoirs and personal recollections?
It has been difficult. I was fortunate that most of the books I wrote at a time when veterans were alive. And when I first started doing the research for Ortona, a lot of the veterans wouldn't talk to me initially because different things like the Valor and the Horror had come out from the McKenna Brothers, a CBC documentary that was very, I would say, it attacked veterans. And so they were, I'm a young guy at that point, I'm in my 30s. So they see this guy and they say, why should I trust him? And it took quite a long time to develop that trust and get them to talk to me. But I managed. And then when Ortona came out, the veterans were reading it and they were saying, okay, he's treating us with respect. And then they started, more and more of them started reaching out to me as they heard I was working on a project. So that was big. In the archives, one thing armies do when they march is they generated, particularly back then, they generated a massive amount of paper. And that material's there, and there's things called lessons learned, and there are accounts. There were historians who were traveling with the divisions and were interviewing soldiers, so that material's there. And then you do get, there were some really good memoirs. Farming Poets, No Birds Sang is probably one of the classics. There's another guy called Stan Sazowski, who was from Perth Regiment in Perth County. Extremely good memoir, but not all of us were brave. So there were some good memoirs out there. I agree, nothing like in the States or the Americans. There were tons and tons and tons of memoirs. But, you know, the material's there. You just have to dig deep and hard to get it. And that's one thing, I'm a very deep dive researcher when I do it. When I go into the archives, I don't try and read stuff when I'm in the archives, especially nowadays, because you can digitally photograph everything. So I'll just go in and I'm just shooting page after page after page after page. And I can do 1,500 pages a day of material. And so when I come back to Victoria, I'll have 20,000, 30,000 pages of material to work through. You know, that's thousands and thousands. And Francis can attest to this. Back when I was photocopying material, I have these folders, and my office would be like a sea of folders around on the floor and desks and everything, all somehow organized into some kind of logical pattern to actually generate these books. But now it's all digital, and you do it all on your computer.
So yeah, that's an incredible amount, and I guess technology has made that somewhat more space-saving, if you will.
Yeah.
So Mark, back to sort of some more logistic stuff about the Second World War. I was just reading, I think it was the Leary Valley book. I can't remember which one. I read a few of them very recently. Anyways, you talked about for each rifle-carrying infantryman, sort of the support that they had. I think the number you said was about 3 support people for every soldier.
Yes.
Do you feel like through your writing you've been able to sort of recognize that sort of forgotten side? Because I know you do really cover a lot of that.
Yeah, and I try to as much as you can. It's kind of complicated with things like the actual Royal Ordnance Corps people who drove the trucks and stuff, because they didn't have the same kind of war diary structure that the infantry regiments do or the artillery regiments do, and so it's very hard to situate what they're doing some of the time. But I try as much as I can to bring into that. And the Leary Valley, of course, one of the things I was looking at was the valley was completely overlooked by German positions at Monte Cassino and other mountains. And so the only way they could supply the soldiers at the front is they had to drive at night, and they would, under smoke screens, they would lay these massive smoke screens, and then the trucks would be just nose to tail going up a road. That was the engineers had built, and they would go up and unload, and they would turn around and then come back down on another road that the engineers had built. So you just have this clockwork thing going clockwise, let's go this way, thing going all night long. And they would just run, and then, you know, once dawn came, even with the smoke screens, the Germans would be able to see it all, so then the trucks stopped. And they did this every day. And that campaign goes on for 6 weeks almost. And you imagine those drivers every night are up, and they're driving, 12 hours a day. And doing it again and again and again. And the Germans, of course, are shelling all the time. They're trying to find them. And so, there were a lot of truckers killed in the process of that. And so those are stories that are, often hard to get, but you dig around and make sure you get that.
Yeah, I found interesting too. I read in some of your books about even the armor regiments. Tanks get shot, they get repaired, they're back in. Like just the amount of physical work that went into keeping soldiers going. So really, we flash back. Now we're going to flash way forward. I understand you're part of a project writing about artillery in Afghanistan, right? And
that's right.
How was that? How is researching that different from researching your usual topics?
It's been completely different. So this is a project that is being funded by the Royal Canadian Artillery Association, and they're doing it's a 2-volume series that's following, what the Canadian artillery personnel did in Afghanistan, which was more than just firing guns. They were involved in all sorts of stuff all over the place. And the big challenge we ran into immediately with this project was everything in the way of documents is still entirely restricted. And so we can't get at them. Largely, we've now opened a little sliver of being able to have a couple retired colonels from the artillery being allowed into the archives, and they're allowed to look at documents and make handwritten notes that then have to be vetted by about 2 different people to make sure, and redacted to meet security clearances. So documentary-wise, it's really poor. The access is very, very bad. So that makes it really hard to tell a narrative. So what we're relying on is interviewing the veterans themselves of Afghanistan to tell their story. That has its challenges. The vast number of Afghanistan veterans that are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder is huge. For many of them, they just won't talk to us. Others, we're having to be very careful when we're interviewing them to monitor, are we hitting something that's going to be a trigger point for that person? I've never had to worry that much about that before with World War II stuff. I did, because there were veterans that you realized that, you had to be careful where you went and things, because you realized emotionally there were things they did not want to talk about or couldn't talk about. So we're running into that with the Afghan Veteran Project. The other big challenges are, and this one is so typically Canadian, a lot of them are sort of saying, well, what I did in Afghanistan didn't matter. My story's not worth hearing. And how many people remember growing up with their dad who was from World War II and that sort of thing, and that the dad would say, oh, what did you do in the war, Daddy? I drove a truck, or something like that. I drove a tank, whatever, and then they move on. So we're having the exact same problem as these fellows from Afghanistan. And another problem we're having is, in World War II, a lot of people wrote letters home, and they kept a diary. What do you do now? You send an email to your beloveds at home. Does that email get saved? Lots of times, no. So, that kind of document, that thread of documents doesn't exist for so many people. So it's a struggle, but we're getting there. Same thing as word gets out that the project's happening, more people are saying, okay, I didn't do much in Afghanistan, but I'll tell you what I did do. And then you of course find out they did a whole hell of a lot, and their story is really important. So it's coming together, and I think it's an important beginning. The Royal Canadian Artillery Association is the first of the associations to really get off the pot and start trying to do this. I'm hopeful that as time goes on, other associations will get in there and the story of, Afghanistan's our longest war. And so a lot of these guys, and girls, what I've come to realize is a lot of them went there 3-4 times. They came home, they turned around, and a year and a half later they're back again. Maybe in a different role, but they're doing that. And if you go on the Veteran Affairs site, it'll say so many thousands of people served in Afghanistan. Some of those, it's the same person 4 times. So the actual number was smaller than what the statistic says. And you think of what that meant for the people involved in it, that went 3 times. That's 18 to 20 months of your life over there. and then same time period preparing to go over. So these people spent, 3-4 years of their lives engaged in a war, personally. So it's not really any different than World War II in the time frame that people went through. And that's not recognized in the general public concept of the Afghan war.
Yeah. Of course, that hits home in an area like Meaford with the training base just up the road. That's something I never thought, when you talk about letters, you have those documents now, you don't have text messages anymore, you don't have the emails like you said, they get deleted, so it's kind of a, technology helps, but it doesn't in that regard.
Yeah.
We're sort of winding down tonight. Just want to ask you, Mark, who do you like to read for books? Obviously Francis's books. but beyond that, who does Mark Zuehlke pick up when he wants to read a book?
Oh, well, when I just want to relax, I just find some good trashy thriller by somebody like Gerald Seymour or something like that. I read those. With terms of history, I tend to read with the military history. I'll just, read what's out there and look at, what's going on, what people are, what are the themes of the day, that people are writing. So you understand what is catching the interest of people, and that gives you a window into where our culture is going particularly in my obsession with remembrance. I can't say any particular writer jumps out at me.
So what can we look forward to from Mark Zuehlke coming down the road?
When I get through this Afghanistan book, which by the way I'm supposed to only be involved in for a year, and it's now 3 years, and I'm only starting writing actually the volume that I'm involved with, but it's supposed to be done by next May. So hopefully, when I'm done with that, can come back to the Canadian Battle Series, I am going to be doing a book on the role that Canada played in the war with Japan. And in that, it's not just going to be the Hong Kong thing, which is what everyone's mind goes to immediately, is the Battle of Hong Kong. It'll be looking at a lot of different parts of the, there was Coastal Command in British Columbia, there were the Canadians who were involved in the invasion of Kiska Island up in the Aleutians. There were Canadians who were involved in Borneo as a special operations executive, Air Force assets in Borneo in India. Lots of different things. You get into there and it's like, well, wow, there were thousands of Canadians involved in the war with Japan and nobody knows about it. And so that's, which of course is the kind of work I've been doing for years. Canadians were there, oh, nobody knows about it. And away we go. So that's it. It's called the Maple Leaf versus the Sun. And I'm also going to be interweaving into that things like the Japanese internment and that here in Canada, and looking at how things were, what was going on domestically in Canada and in relationship to that and stuff. So it's going to be a little different than my normal Canadian Battle Series books, but I think it's going to be an interesting one. I've done a lot of research. I just need to do more research and then get going.
Yeah, right on. It's actually, a question just popped in my mind there when you were talking. You're from Victoria. Is there more awareness on the West Coast about the conflict with Japan? Because in Ontario, we were so far removed from that.
I think they're a little bit, particularly because there were two organizations that are really strong and are still quite strong in Victoria. The Hong Kong Veterans Association had a really strong chapter in Victoria, and another really strong one in Vancouver. And then there's actually the Burma Veterans Association, which still participates in the Remembrance Day ceremonies at the Victoria Legislature every year. It's amazing that these guys there's nothing of them alive that they can, and that they're in condition that they can come out and march every year. So there is that kind of presence of mind, I think, there. And you can go along the West Coast. You go up to Tofino and there's this big radar station hill where we had a major radar that was monitoring what the Japanese were doing offshore, and you know, so there's different, you know, monuments and presences of military bases and stuff that were designed to defend Canada against potential Japanese invasion.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so that concludes my my questions for Mark tonight. We're going to be around here, so you know, Mark's going to be available to chat. But does anybody have